770, we're marching out unto victory without a doubt. To corners four, we're marching happily. Nation after nation, we are conquering. Shluchei Yadeinu, to bring Mashiach Tzidkenu. Tomorrow will be gone, no more, for we'll win this glorious war. Shluchei Yadeinu, lehavi Mashiach Tzidkenu. Nit'orer min hachalom, Mashiach gegeben mit dem ganzen Leben. Wir finden sich in alle Städte, in alle Ecken von der Welt. Wir seien die Schluchim von Reben. Wir finden sich in alle Städte, in alle Ecken von der Welt. Wir seien die Schluchim von Reben. 40 Jahre hat der Rebbe uns gelernt. A Schliach ist kein Monetell. Falschsprechen, Jüdischkeiten schrecken sich von Schwierigkeit. Wir seien die Schluchim von Reben. Verspreiten Jüdischkeit, nicht schrecken sich von Schwierigkeit. Wir seien die Schluchim von Reben. Mit Chumrius nicht einfach habet, mit Zoyim nur gepravet. Wir seien die Schluchim von Reben. Mit Gashmius nicht einfach habet, Shiurim nur gepravet. Wir seien die Schluchim von Reben.
Kids, your grandkids, great grandkids, and your whole community. And for you, it's going to be fine. No? Fine. Come on.
Everyone, say l'chaim. L'chaim. Get the farbrengen started. This farbrengen is sponsored by the Gavin family in honor of Danny Gavin birthday, Daniel Yaakov of Baruch Shlema Halevi. Would like to wish you health, and as Rabbi Lazarov loves to say, health, wealth, and time to enjoy it. So l'chaim, everyone. L'chaim. We're now going to show the story of the Rosh Chodesh Kislev farbrengen. The story, the history of the Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and then Rabbi Lew will join us, and then we will then have Dr. Weiss joining us as well.
Hoshana Rabbah in 1977 began as it always would. But as the Rebbe took to his place, events began to take an extraordinary turn. Never on a solemn day such as this would the Rebbe so encourage the singing before morning prayers, and with a joy reminiscent of the Simchas Torah HaKafos. That night, during the Hakafos celebration, the Rebbe suffered a massive heart attack. He would remain in his room for the next 5 weeks.
They were singing, and the Rebbe didn't look good. And he was leaning his arm on the stender and just clapping like this, which was very unusual, because in Simchas Torah, the Rebbe would work the crowd. And the Rebbe would walk around the platform that he stood on to make sure that every side got his attention and was inspired for joy. But the Rebbe looked very, very pale. And he then made the hakafa very quick, and he turned towards the Mizrach, and then he turned around looking for someone. So my father went over to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, "Eib's nit schwer, bring a benkel evgich." So the chair came, and people started to scream, Wasser, Wasser, to bring water. And Dr. Winch was there. He was a ER doctor from Miami, and he jumped up as well. And he was the first one to say, if I remember correctly, that it's an issue with the heart. Fear and pandemonium gripped us. Fear that something is happening to the Rebbe, and pandemonium, not knowing what to do. And the first reaction was to get everybody out of the shul. But meanwhile, a lot of people ran out, and they broke open all the windows to air. There was a very small crowd that was left, and I wasn't downstairs, whatever happened later, but I heard the Hakafos went. I remember the Rebbe walking up the steps, and perhaps it was a foolish thing, but we were all going nuts. We smensch. We never saw this thing, and we didn't know how to deal with it. And we were so worried, so I hid in the zal, and the door was open a crack, and the Rebbe was walking up the steps slowly. And the Rebbe saw me look, and I don't think he was happy. So I pushed myself away, and the Rebbe went into his room, and he closed the door. The doctors that came in the middle of the night and examined the Rebbe said that this could be major. So my father went into the Rebbe and said, since the Rebbe doesn't want to go to the hospital, Efshar soll man da machen dem hospital. And the Rebbe said, yeah.
Two nights after the heart attack, the doctors allowed the Rebbe to speak from his room for 5 minutes.
Als noch a Dole, und noch dem, was mir vernammelt und die Kirche schon gebrochen, was der Rebbe soll gesund sein mit der Roge geschickt, wird der Rebbe sitzen bei sich im Cheder und sagen als sicher, was wir mit Herren da in Schul auf dem Mikrofon.
Upon hearing the news that the Rebbe would address them, the Chasidim's joy was indescribable.
אז זה מפני הסיבה, רט mir noch Havdole, wo der Fall kommen nutzen, seine Drochim, a Fieber geben, das was mir redt. Lemikemis Rechekim Begashmiis, aber selbstverständlich Krevim, Beruchnis, was bei Jiden nicht das der Riker, und bei ihm soll die Resim nicht schon mal Iker, wie Guf am Tofel, wie der alte Rebbe sagt in Tanja, wie hier Rotzen, als Miusad auf die Maimore Rabbeseni Niseino, soll das einer sei bei jeder und bei jeder, Betechechi Klal Israel, als einer Schono Tevum und Vorachas, Betev Hanire Vanigle Matom Asorot Vochim, in Bonne Chayum Zeinu Bekulum, Riviche, Kipschute, Bonne Chayum Zeinu Riviche, Beruchnis, שנשתל שלום מהם, ומזל גין ביאנקי והולך לדרכי, מתך שמחה וטוב לבוב, ומתות es in Neven, wie man nennt es von Simcha Stero, was Simcha ist der Peretz, kol Hagdorim, der Meilo, wenn wir Dide Hagbolo, bis Wanter das Echet Peretz und Mevatel, die Gdorim und der Hagboles von Goles Apnimi, und die Gdorim und Hagboles von Goles Kipschute, als wir Seichu Bekore Mamosh, והננו סרזנו בשופחו ליצים ברחמים ביגולו המיתיס והשלמו על ידי משיח צדקנו יובה וילכנו כממיס לארצנו במהרה בימינו ממוש ויבנה ביס המקדוש במקיימה ויקבץ נצחי ישראל und aus Epech al kol hamim kulam, sofa achasli, auf die kulam, shechem echod, von behoysel havaya am lucha. Ve'atem tluk tulechad lechad, beis Yisroel, wie Rashi Taish Shasov, als der Rebischter nimmt, jede Rieden von Hand, und fiete Maris von Golos und bekore Mamosh und bringt ihm in Arsena Hagdesho Eretz, asher eine Weile Kechabo, Berishis Ashono, Vad Achri Shono, und Besimcho Vtuv Livov, Kohol Godli Aveu Heino, und wie es steht bei der Geitze und die Geüber, Hachreino, was ich bekore Mamosh, als genein und ins Geriet wird nicht bleiben in Golos. Und der Rebbe wird sie allen Aris nehmen, bechesed uberachmim, ubetev hanide v'haniglo, ubekore mamosh ba'golo didan.
The word heart attack was used in the press, in the Allgemeiner Journal, for example, used the word heart attack, but we couldn't really justifiably describe the extent of this heart attack to the public. But from what I heard even on the telephone, he had on a scale of 10, he had the full 10 heart attack. I'm willing to tell you about it now, and I'm willing to tell the public, because they should recognize what a miracle this case was. The miracle being that the Rebbe had a heart attack that involved such extensive damage that in anyone's normal medical experience, one would worry about the possibility of survival, and one would almost discount any possibility of functionality at the level of the Rebbe's. You know, we would think about a person who's perpetually short of breath and is connected to his oxygen and is barely able to walk a few steps from the bed, and the potential for severe arrhythmias, and the potential that they really wouldn't have months or maybe even as much as a year with that type of limitation. And I'll tell you that the Rebbe was at his full strength in the subsequent 15 years until he encountered another medical hazard. But in those 15 years, he showed vigor at farbrengens. I examined him after each major farbrengen as I came in from Chicago to be sure that I wasn't pushing the envelope and allowing him to do too much. His cardiovascular measurements were excellent. We went into the room privately for about an hour before he would start talking to other people, just to make those measurements. And I was very pleased. He really was medically like a giant, like a very strong person giving a farbrengen, as if the heart attack had not occurred. I'm not exaggerating on this. It was beyond, all the time was beyond my wildest expectation.
Through his critical illness, the Rebbe continued to work, responding to thousands of letters, addressing the public, never taking even one full day's rest. Only 5 weeks later, on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, in what the doctors would term a miraculous recovery, the Rebbe left 770 for home for the first time. The Rebbe's recovery and his leaving the ICU at 770 was a signal to his Hasidim and to the entire world that he would continue to lead, to teach, and to inspire. In the subsequent years, the Rebbe proceeded to issue thousands of hours of Torah teachings, launch numerous campaigns, and to send out hundreds of shluchim, changing the face of world Jewry forever and setting in motion a renaissance for all of Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe's illustration of unwavering dedication, even during the most difficult times, set an example for his shluchim of true responsibility toward every single man, woman, and child.
Rabbi Lew, welcome. Thank you for coming and for joining us here in Houston, Texas. It's a great honor to welcome Rabbi Lew, who is an amazing historian. So Rabbi Lew, as you can see on the screen, we have there the community of Anash is gathered. Not everybody is in front of the camera, but they all see you, and you can hear them, and they can hear you. So free to address the crowd. You need to unmute yourself. Chaim.
Chaim Houston. L'chaim friends, and hopefully new friends by the time the evening is over. L'chaim. I think I see Rabbi Lazar, Senior. Is Rabbi Lazar Senior around?
Yes, Yes, he's here.
Oh, fantastic. L'chaim Rabbi Lazarov, the Rebbe's head shliach to the state of Texas. The video that was just shown over here, it gives the seriousness of the issue, and then the great miracle 5 weeks later after a heart attack that the Rebbe's own doctor said it was number 10 on a scale of 10, and you can expect who knows what after that. And the Rebbe went home 5 weeks later, and we celebrate this on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, is a very telling presentation of the story. There's another aspect to that story that doesn't get the attention that everything else gets. And the other aspect is that the Rebbe, it was mentioned briefly that the Rebbe spoke from his room a day and a half, maybe about 48 hours after suffering the heart attack. They told the Rebbe that he would have 5 minutes. He spoke for 25 minutes. And the Rebbe said a short sicha, a short mimer, and then another short sicha. A total of 25 minutes. That was a Motzei Simchas Torah. A few days later, it was Shabbos Bereshis. The Rebbe always farbrengen on Shabbos Mevorchim, and Shabbos Bereshis is always Shabbos Mevorchim. And so the Rebbe asked permission, and they told him for 20 minutes. The Rebbe spoke for a half hour, a sicha, a mimer, and a sicha. The next Saturday night, they asked, the Rebbe asked again to speak, and then the next Saturday night again. So 3 weeks in a row on the Motzei Shabbos, each one becoming a little longer than the other one. Then it was Shabbos Mevorchim Kislev, Chaye Sarah, and the Rebbe spoke again in a similar format for about an hour, over an hour. And then the Rebbe went home. The following Shabbos after the Rebbe went home was Toldos, like it is this week, this year. And there was no talk from the Rebbe. But the one after that was Vayetze. And Vayetze was around the Yortzeit and the birthday of the Mittler Rebbe, on the same day, Tes Kislev, and the Ula of the Mittler Rebbe on Yud Kislev. So that Motzei Shabbos, Vayetze, was the first time that the Rebbe spoke to the Chassidim publicly after he went home. And the Rebbe said then a talk for 2.5 hours. 1.5 hours of that was a mimer, the longest mimer that the Rebbe ever said. And it takes up about, I think it was 28 pages in print. And this mimer, the Rebbe treated this mimer with an incredibly powerful attention. It was 10 years after Rosh Chodesh Kislev, in the year 1987. 87. The first time was 1970, late 77, October, November of 77. Not October, November 77. This was November 87. 10 years later, it was the first time at the behest of the Rebbe that all the shluchim from around the world were invited to come to the kinnis, to the convention. Until that point, the convention was only for US and Canada, and Israel made their own convention, and it was expected, I guess, that people would make their own thing. But the Rebbe asked that this convention should be a worldwide convention. Oilami. And that was the first year in 1987, Tafshin Mem Ches. And it was 10 years since Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and that year, Rosh Chodesh Kislev was on Motzei Shabbos, Toldos. So that Shabbos Toldos was one of the most spectacular farbrengens in all of the history of the Rebbe. Because the Rebbe devoted most of this farbrengen to the shluchim. That was unprecedented. 3 full, complete sichas to the shluchim. And in those sichas were brachas like we never heard before. V'yitem l'cha Elokim, v'yitem v'yachzev, v'yitem, may God give you, bless you. The Rebbe splurged. The Rebbe also said financially people are struggling. I'm going to step in. And he offered loans for a 5-year term. Free loans, interest-free loans. To relieve some of the pressure, financial pressures. And when the Rebbe left the farbrengen, it was already long after Shabbos. The mincha did Avamayev right away, and the Rebbe left the farbrengen. And they started singing the Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and the Rebbe was, and the people were going nuts. There was a dance that went on. Nobody really left. People were just praising the Eibishter. For 10 incredible years, for the Ness, and for the leadership, and for the shluchim, and for the Sfarim that were coming home then. It was an amazing, amazing time. The Sfarim came home tonight. That's Beis Kislev. What's tonight's date? So, and the Rebbe, at that farbrengen, said he wants to give a special gift to the shluchim. And he's going to give a mimer that he himself had said that was extremely unusual. Which mimer? The mimer that the Rebbe said the first time after he went home on Rosh Chodesh Kislev. And the next day was Sunday, was Rosh Chodesh Kislev. The Rebbe said a sicha. Then the Rebbe distributed by hand to each shliach only, and then to each shlucha, this mimer that had been edited by the Rebbe, his mimer, that people should learn. So the Rebbe, when the Rebbe said a mimer, it wasn't just simply teaching some chassidus. There was everything in that mimer. The Rebbe's thoughts and whatever was pressing on the Rebbe at that time would come out in the mimer. And from the beginning of the mimer, what we call the Dibur HaMaschil, the opening words, whether it's a pasuk or it's a mimer chazal or something like that, you can usually, if there was a special occasion, one can tell what was on the Rebbe's mind. And this mimer began with the words of next week's parsha, V'shavti b'sholem el beis ovi, v'hoya Hashem li leilikim. And I will return to the house of my father. Return to the house. This is the first mimer and opening really words of a talk, of a sicha, that the Rebbe said after he went back. To be honest, the Rebbe did not quite celebrate the day. Hasidim did. Every year there was a very big farbrengen with bread and meat and chicken. It was a big deal. Hasidim came to celebrate. There was, of course, a bottle of mashkin that the Rebbe had given for this. But it wasn't something that the Rebbe particularly celebrated. Hasidim, this was a very big deal. The Rebbe didn't not celebrate it. He just didn't openly celebrate it. And we'll soon get to that. But this mimer on the words of next week's parsha, V'shavti b'sholem el beis ovi, are the words that Yaakov said. He was asking Hashem to look after him after realizing from his dream that this is Beis Elokim, in the house of God here, and V'zer Shar Hashamayim, in the gates to heaven. He said to Hashem, if you will be with me, and you will protect me, and V'shavti v'sholem el beis ovi, and you'll bring me back home, house of my father, and you will be my God. And the mimer is so long that it can take a good year and a half to learn this hour and a half mimer. But just a very brief point in this mimer. The Rebbe spoke, the main theme of this mimer is the importance of a body of a Jew, of a Yid. And that we often think that when the neshama comes down to this world, and then Vashafti Vasholem Abesovi goes back up, it's in order that there should be an elevation to the neshama. And that's right. That is correct. But the Rebbe said there's something else that's involved, and that is that the body that carries the soul, that houses the soul, that body has the ability to turn around this world. Because it's the body that gives tzedakah, and it's the body that eats matzah, and it's the body that puts on tefillin, etc., etc. It's the body that makes this world into Hashem's world, not the neshama. And therefore, it's not merely that the neshama is receiving an elevation, but the whole world is receiving an elevation, and especially the body that carries this out. Of course, here you go with a very strong reference to the Rebbe's body that needed some refuah shalema. And the Rebbe said, to return to the father's house is who is the father in this case? It's Yitzchak. And Yitzchak, a great celebration, a great joy. The real joy of a Yid doing a mitzvah is that the body is elevated through this. That's the real focus. The mimer is long and rich and very the point that it makes is phenomenal. But again, this is just a brief little look at what the Rebbe was thinking in those very important days to Hasidim. After the Rebbe left home at night, they took out the Sifrei Torah, they did Ata Haresas 3 times, and there was a full-fledged Hakafas, which was missing on the Sifrei Torah night. Of course, everybody did the Hakafas, but it wasn't with joy. So much joy that the Rebbetzin looked out the window as the Rebbe was leaving to home. She was in 770 during this time. And she said she's never seen a joy like this since her father, the Frierdiker Rebbe, was released from jail. The joy was, you can imagine. So what was the Rebbe thinking? As the Hasidim were in such ecstasy and joy and hoping for more developments. The Rebbe was thinking about what does it mean that a Jewish body is able to come back to itself and is able to continue to perform and to be that the person was before. And that is so typical of the Rebbe, to turn something as potentially devastating as this and the miracle that the Rebbe experienced, not simply joy, but joy of a body doing another mitzvah. And this idea was very strongly emphasized at the Rebbe's 70th birthday. This year we celebrate the Rebbe's 70 years of leadership, from Yud Shvat Tavshin Yud to Yud Shvat Tavshin Pei. We're still in that year. When the Rebbe turned 70, there was an amazing buzz in the Babish. The Babish was nowhere near as big. We're talking 1972. But anybody, the Rebbe's birthday is 4 days before Pesach. But anyone who was anyone knew that they were going to be in New York for that day. And because it was a Sunday that year, people were already coming for Shabbos. And a Lubavitcher Rebbe to turn 70 had not happened since the days of the Tzemach Tzedek, or over 100 years before. Nobody was alive in 1972 who was there when the Tzemach Tzedek turned 70. And people came up with all kinds of initiatives, study 70 pages and learn 70 mamarim and give $70 and et cetera, et cetera. And as the time got closer, it became more and more and more palpable that something special is happening here. And then there was the farbrengen on Sunday night, and a long farbrengen went on for 6 hours. And the first part of the farbrengen before the mimer was about the toil that a person is supposed to undergo throughout life. Just an amazing theme, beautiful explanations about this whole idea, this whole concept. Man was born to toil, which is the words of the pasuk in Koheles. And then came the mimer, and after the mimer, they began to sing the niggin. Hashem chasisi, Hashem chasisi. That was a niggin that was on the words of the opening words of Kapitel Ayin Aleph, the Rebbe's Kapitel for that year. This was a niggin that nobody heard before because it did not come from Lubavitch origins. The niggin is more like from Bobov or somewhere in Poland. But Rabbi Moshe Telashevsky, who heard this niggin back in Russia or something, and he remembered it, and that's the niggin that was put into this, and it was a fascinating niggin, the niggin itself, and the Rebbe really took to this niggin, and they had sung this niggin before in this very farbrengen, and it was highly unusual for them to sing the same song twice, or even 3 times, but it just had to happen. And in fact, the guy who usually started the nigunim started something else, but Hasidim down in the middle, right under the Rebbe's table, just burst out with this niggin yet again. And here came something that never happened before and never happens after that. The niggin was sung for approximately 25 minutes. And the Rebbe, who would often encourage the singing, did encourage the singing over here. But the response, the way the Hasidim responded to this was completely disproportionate. Everybody was just dancing and jumping up and down. You can watch this video. I did. The first time I got it, the first time I received the CD about 10 years ago or so, I spent the entire night, without realizing it, playing this thing over and over again from about 1 o'clock in the morning till 6. Because it is so enrapturing. And I'll explain to you, when I was 13 or 14, in that year, I was just before my 8th birthday, 1972. I remember the excitement, the buzz, but I wasn't capable of knowing quite what was going on, certainly not understanding what the Rebbe was saying. But when I was older, 13, 14, I was going through that farbrengen in the transcript, in the Hanocha, and I noticed that they wrote something over there, that they sang the Niggin B'char Hashem Chasisi with his Oididus Gedola, with a great inspiration. And then the Rebbe said the following sikha. The Rebbe responded to a niggin, to this niggin. And I asked my father, and I asked dozens of people who were there, what does it mean that they sang a niggin b'his oilus gedola? When you write that in a transcript, you're trying to say something. What are you saying? What happened there? There was a great inspiration. What does that mean? And nobody could really put their finger on it. And I am a curious type, and I didn't give up until I saw the video, and I watched this thing again and again and again. And when I saw them, when it suddenly hit me, that everyone was there. Everyone was from around the world was there, and they were all dancing up and down. Even the people who usually sat had raised themselves, and they were just dancing, and they were screaming, "We love you," or "I love you." There's no other way to really explain that. Saying it, you can see it, you can feel it, especially if you spend the night watching it like crazy me. And all the people that I had asked in the previous years, like what happened over there, when I went back to them, I said, would you agree that this is what it was happening over there? No one has told me, no, come on, get off. That's not, come on. Nobody said that. Everybody said, you know what, you got it. You put your finger on it. And so they sang this niggin for 25 minutes, and everybody was singing it, and everybody was dancing, and everybody was really, really into it. It was just an outcry of, an outpouring of love. And so the Rebbe responded to this. How did the Rebbe respond? Also, fascinating, only time it ever happened like this, that the Rebbe should respond to such a feeling publicly, acknowledge that this feeling was there, and this is how the Rebbe responded. The Rebbe said that there are people who are suggesting that because he hit his 70th birthday, it's now time to take it easy, to rest up, to begin the process of retiring. And the Rebbe said, first of all, you don't look at the passport. You look at the person's energy that is God-given. And if a person has energy, then it doesn't matter what birthday it is. And the Rebbe spoke quite at length about this, with peppered with some sense of humor discussions here. And then the Rebbe said like this. He said, I would like to ask that by my next birthday, in 1 year from today, 71, in honor of Kapitel Ayin Aleph, 71 new institutions should be built in Lubavitch. To say that in 1972 would be like saying today, I want 5,000 by next year. And there was a sort of, like, you can hear it, although it's not there, but you can sort of hear like an exclamation, like, what? 72, 71 new institutions, what does that mean? How could anybody even think that? And the Rebbe said, you shouldn't be worried about it. You'll see, once you get to work, you'll see how it'll come so naturally. And there was many more than 71 by the next Yud Aleph Nisan, by the Rebbe's next birthday. In other words, what the Rebbe was saying was, dancing and just singing, that's not what Chabad does. Oh, we dance. We know how to dance. On Rosh Chodesh Kislev, on Kislev, we do all of that. But if it's not going to come out, if you have such a powerful reaction of love, then that needs to be translated in Avodah. It needs to be translated in work you can do in the world. Like the Rebbe says in the Maimer, says Yaakov Avinu took stones and he turned that into Beis Elokim, into the house of God. A stone is one of the lowest denominations on this world. It's lifeless. It stands there. But that he took and turned it into a Beis Elokim, into the Beis HaMikdash. The translation of love to the Rebbe, of the great miracle, the celebration, is to go out and build more institutions. If you love me, that's what you need to do. It's singing and dancing, it's great, but if it's not anywhere, then it's emotions that God nowhere. I once had a Belzer Chossid in my house for Shabbos. In Atlanta. In those days, I was living in the Atlanta area.
Rabbi Lew, actually, Texas, America's Union Chinuch of Texas, is one of the Shivim V'achas Meistes of Lamed Beis.
L'chaim to that.
L'chaim.
There you go. Texas is built on love for the Rebbe in its purest sense. So I had a Belzer Chassid that came to visit Atlanta for some kind of show. They have in Atlanta, it's one of the areas in the United States where people come to put on some kind of a show. They have diamonds and they have furniture, etc. So this guy came and he stayed by me for Shabbos. And during the Shabbos, I tried my best to make the man feel at home. I found the benches, the NCSY benches that have all these zemiros, and I offered to sing some songs if I didn't know it. Some of the Belzer songs I knew. Anyway, he was having a good time. And then about an hour or so, maybe 2 hours before the end of Shabbos, I said to him, "Have you seen the clips of the Belzer Rebbe on the internet?" He says, "Internet? I don't have the internet." I said, "Look, I have internet, and we're going to look for some clips before you leave. After Havdalah, we'll watch some Bells clips." And after Havdalah, I opened up my laptop and I turned. It must have been YouTube. I don't remember. It's a while ago, and we found some clips. The Belzer Rebbe doing this, Belzer Rebbe walking, the Belzer Rebbe sitting, Belzer Rebbe standing, Belzer Rebbe davening, dancing, whatever. And then there was a relatively longer clip from Motzei Yom Kippur Tish. I don't know the order, what happens in Bells on Motzei Yom Kippur, but there was a lot of food on that table. Half of the table, they have a big table, and half of it was packed with all kinds of breads and challahs and fish and meats and chickens and cakes, and it was like a table laden with good. I wonder how that works. Do people not go home? I don't know. Anyway, the clip, like every minute or so, it moved on to something else, because first you saw the table filled with stuff, and then a minute later, the next part of the clip was half of the table was missing already. So and they were passing up fruits or rice, and people were eating. And eventually, as the 10 or 15 minute clip moves, you get to the end of the table is open, empty. Food is all gone, and it's time for benching. And they bench, and then they stand up and they do one of these dances. And I'm watching this guy, this Belzer Chassid, and he is in heaven. You say, he's having the time of his life, a grin from ear to ear. And I felt really good, felt very happy about this. And at the end, when the clip ended, the song and dance was over, he turns to me and he says, "Azam manhigas," which loosely translated means such leadership. And I said, oh, hold on a second. You know, if he wants to say how appreciative he is of seeing a clip like this and how beautiful it was and everything else, I can take that. But what are you talking about leadership here? So I said, what do you mean? What do you mean by this? He said, look how many people are there. It's, leadership, so many people. So I said, I think that the Gera group has even more people. He said, "Puh, Ger." Goodbye, Ger. I said, what are you doing? What do you mean? He says, the Gera Rebbe doesn't say any Torah, doesn't teach any Torah at his tish. I said, what about the Belzer Rebbe? He says, what do you mean? It's Torah every single week. I said, okay, what did he say last Shabbos? What did he say last week? He says, well, I don't know, it was last Shabbos. I said, okay, well, Shabbos Kiseitze. What did he say last year, Shabbos Kiseitze? He says, I don't know. I said, look, he's been a Rebbe for, I think it was 30 years or 32 years by then, or 22. I said, he's been a Rebbe for some 3 decades. Can you share with me one word of Torah that the Belzer Rebbe ever said? He admitted that he couldn't. I said, what kind of leadership are you talking about here? You're talking leadership about the chicken and the cake and the fruits and the songs? again, I'm not trying to chas v'shalom, I'm not trying to disrespect bells and the bells of Rebbe and the bells of Hasidim and whatever, however they function. It's all good for them. And what I told him was, maybe this is a sharp kind of word response, but I said to him like this: the first Belzer Rebbe was a very big tzaddik. He lived in the times of the Rebbe Maharash. The Maharash went to visit him even. He was the Sar Shalom of bells, and he said a statement. He said, "Bells with allemaal zijn a winkel for Torah and Yiras Shamayim," which means that bells will always be a corner for learning Torah and for Yiras Shamayim. So I said to him, listen, bells with allemaal zijn a winkel for Torah and Yiras Shamayim. You know that statement. He said, sure, every bell's a chassid knows. I said, you will always have your corner, but the Rebbe has the rest of the world. That's manhigas. Because when the Rebbe was trying to establish, and this is the word the Rebbe used, when he was talking about at his 70th birthday farbrengen in that sikha after that song, he said, I was waiting for a moment that I can establish something where kaviyas was really strong. This is the moment. What was the moment? You're singing and dancing. Now you go and translate that into spreading Torah and turning the world into a Beis Elikim. And where would we be without the Rebbe's Torah? The whole success of Chabad is that attitude and that meaning and that way of understanding Torah, and that's what has turned over the world and getting ready for Mashiach any minute. That's manhigus. That's real leadership. So on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, when the Rebbe went home and the simcha went through the roof, especially in 770, but around the world, and since then, the celebration is obviously the celebration of the miracle. As Dr. Weiss said before, number 10 out of 10. But the celebration has to be translated into real leadership, as the Rebbe wanted at his birthday, and obviously right after Rosh Chodesh Kislev. This is what the Rebbe was saying for an hour and a half in the Maimer. I returned home. It's now time to get to work. And getting to work for a chassid means to learn the Rebbe's Torah so that chassid can spread those words wherever he goes or wherever she goes. So I say l'chaim, I think I'm running out of time here, or maybe I've run out of time. I say l'chaim. We're going to hear from the doctor himself, which is such a major schus. L'chaim, may we be not just proper chassidim, but proper leaders in the way the Rebbe wants us to be. L'chaim.
L'chaim, l'chaim. Dr. Weiss was here a moment ago, and he stepped away. Oh, and here he is.
Here's Dr. Weiss. Dr. Weiss may not remember this because every chassid wants to be a part of his life. But a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, we were on a panel together for Off Base Shvat about the Rebbetzin. And we did this in Crown Heights. And Dr. Weiss was traveling back at the same time as I was, in the same time frame. And Dr. Weiss stays by Rabbi Krinsky every time he comes to New York. And I was asked if it wouldn't be too much trouble to have Dr. Weiss in my car and we'll go to the airport together. And it was one of the highlights of my life. I can say that with a certainty. I was sitting next to a person who had the incredible merit, not merely to nurse the Rebbe back to health, which in and of itself, Dr. Weiss has gone down in the annals of the 7 generations of Chabad as one of the great people. But Dr. Weiss continued to to monitor the Rebbe, and came in like once a month or so before every major farbrengen, and dealt with the Rebbe. Dr. Weiss touched the Rebbe so many times. There's no way that Dr. Weiss is not a truly holy person. It's not possible that this cannot rub off on the doctor. And in addition to that, he also spoke to the Rebbitzin every single day. That's what we found out on this panel. And the Rebbitzin, he turned the Rebbitzin into somebody who's looking out for the Chicago Cubs, because the Rebbitzin knew that Dr. Weiss is a Cubs fan. I'm sorry, guys from Houston, we have the American League over there, and the Cubs are in that other league. But this is a story that is, I heard this from Dr. Weiss himself, and I took the very long way to get to the airport so I can spend more time breaking with Dr. Weiss in the car. And truly one of the great highlights. Told me things then that have stayed with me. What a holy, great man.
Well, here I thought, Rabbi Lew, you had lost your way and I didn't have a roadmap, so I can explain how that happened.
Dr. Weiss, welcome. This is Rabbi Chaim Lazarov. We spoke on the phone a few days ago.
Yes.
And we're speaking to the Anash community of Houston. They're gathered there outdoors. If you can see on the screen, the partial group of the crowd sitting socially distanced with individual packages. You can have little Chaim bottles to make sure they're individuals. And we're really happy to have you Zoom in with us.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be joining you. And first of all, good Yom Tov, everybody. Happy Rosh Chodesh Kislev. Coming off of the Kinus Hashluchim and having this beautiful celebration convocation as you're running and as other cities are running as well, is just emblematic of how the Rebbe spread the word and how the story I'm about to tell a little bit had an impact on how the Rebbe spread that word on even a deeper level in the years that he regained his strength after suffering a heart attack 43 years ago. I'm sure many of you have heard the story. I don't want to bore you with endless details, but it was an unusual story because at the time I was like a beginner in the cardiology field of cardiology practice. I had done all my training, but I was really kind of new, and I was 33 years old, and I was not expecting any assignment on any level, and certainly not a level like this. But the way it started is that, as you know, that the Rebbe unexpectedly turned ill on Shmini Atzeres, Erev Shmini Atzeres. He was in the shul. He turned sick. Everyone was in panic. No one expected such a strong Rebbe suddenly to change in the status of illness. And there was no preparation for this medically because there was no reason of having such preparedness. And I wasn't there, but I heard that people were breaking the windows in 770 to provide air for the Rebbe. And people were going to all kinds of lengths, making personal pledges to the Creator that they would do anything so that the Rebbe's health could be restored. But as luck would have it, his blood pressure and his status deteriorated, but not before he announced to his following that he insisted on having his care at 770 instead of at a hospital, even though all the doctors who happened to be visiting on that day to attend the farbrengen and to attend the Yom Tov services of Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah, they all pleaded with him to be reasonable about the reality that when you have what looks to them like a heart attack, and this was confirmed with an electrocardiogram that someone brought in from the neighborhood, that when you have a heart attack, you are obligated to be watched for irregular heart rhythms, the ability of the heart to suddenly lose its stability or cadence so that there's no rhythm, God forbid, and there's the potential of having all types of other problems related to low blood flow to the tissues, including the brain, the kidneys, and other vital things that might be shortchanged when there's an inadequate pumping output of the heart. So the explanations were given by sincere, well-meaning doctors, and the Rebbe would have no part of it. And he told them he really wants the care to be given at 770. And as I weave the long story along, I'll try to explain how it was that the Rebbe came to this thinking, because it didn't make sense to any doctor who saw how he looked. And Rebbetzin Schneerson heard this as well, and she backed up her husband's decision 100%. She told Rebbe Krinsky that my husband makes such careful decisions he wouldn't stray off the path of his carefulness in making a decision and give you the wrong idea of where he should be. So I also insist that he be cared for right here as he requested. But as luck would have it, that night, while many of us went off happy it was Yom Tov and happy we were fast asleep in our various cities, the Rebbe lost much of his blood pressure and could no longer communicate. He didn't have that kind of blood supply to his head or anywhere else to be able to engage in conversation. So at 7 in the morning, when I was getting ready, 7 in the morning local time here, when I was getting ready to go to shul in Chicago, I got a call on my medical phone, which is answered on Shabbos and Yom Tov because of the medical necessities that are usually applied when that phone rings. I answered the phone and I heard Rabbi Krinsky. I remember the name Krinsky because my Cheder-based childhood. I was a little child who went to public schools, but I attended after school a wonderful Cheder, a Agudas Chabad in Chicago, and Rabbi Herschel Schusterman was the Rav, and his wife Chava Schusterman was one of the teachers and very devoted wife, and she was the sister of Rabbi Krinsky. So Rabbi Krinsky knew of me through her, and there was one other way that Rabbi Krinsky knew of me, in that a few years before the heart attack, which was around 1973, I was able to publish a cardiology text. I was pretty young for doing this, but I was very interested in the logic behind reading the complex arrhythmias or irregular rhythms that are in a cardiogram. It was just at the time that Texas Instruments down your way in Texas patented the first integrated circuit. And that opened the gateway to miniaturizing from mainframe computers, which occupied a whole room, to devices that you could hold in your hand, like little pocket calculators or little monitoring devices in a hospital that could record all the information, because an integrated circuit allowed you to miniaturize to that extent. And this was a Texas invention, you might want to know. So just when I was writing the book, the people who were developing these technologies in Texas and other places that were copying the Texas pattern of an integrated circuit wanted to have a way of understanding how to decipher the cardiogram for its rhythm by computer logic. So it became the Bible for them on how to do this. This was the only book written of its type. And it was a teaching book that was recommended in all the medical schools around the world, all the English-speaking medical schools around the world. So it had many printings. It was a popular book. And in the little book won me my wife. At Harvard, where I was teaching, they asked me to give a kiddush in honor of the book. And I gave the kiddush at the Harvard Hillel. And my wife unexpectedly shows up there at the kiddush. And I saw her for the first time and said, this is the girl. And 3 months later, we were married. So it brought me my wife, and it brought me some notoriety in 770 because I decided to send Rabbi Schusterman, my Cheder teacher, the book just to show what a Cheder student of his was up to. And he decided to send it to his brother-in-law, Rabbi Yehuda Krinsky, and Rabbi Krinsky decided to show it to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe decided that it was a very interesting book, so he kept it in his office. Now, you know the size of his study, for those of you've been in 770. It was not what you call a big office with limited bookshelf space, but one of the books on his shelf was my book, because periodically he would look at it for the mathematical challenge of seeing if he could see how this works. It was just a curiosity of his. So I was kind of known in the office, even though they never met me. And so the name came up, and most of them had no idea that I was just a youngster, a beginner. But he called me for a question, not to come in to help the Rebbe, but he was asking me, Dr. Weiss, the Rebbe is now hardly able to speak. He's practically unconscious from a low blood pressure. Is it medically ethical to take him in an ambulance without us being aware of it, so that he could find himself waking up in some good hospital in New York that will take care of his heart attack? And I told Rabbi Krinsky, it certainly makes medical sense. I'm sure that the thought is a very good one, but yet the Rebbe expressly stated, as did his wife, that they don't want any part of this. And I'll explain later in the story why that made sense in retrospect, not at the time, but it made sense as we look at the whole case. And I told Rabbi Krinsky it wouldn't be really totally medically ethical to pull this on the Rebbe so that he could wake up in a hospital, but on the other hand, it might be life-saving to do it. So I thought of another possibility. I explained to the staff there that in my training in Boston, I had seen some brilliant cardiologists who trained me take the responsibility of caring for US presidents and caring for heads of state and caring for someone like Madame de Rothschild, and having things set up in their private domain. For example, in the Rothschild case, she needed a special kind of heart valve that was best done in New Zealand. She at that time was in Europe, and our team was asked to accompany her on her private airplane, taking her to New Zealand. And as she was on the plane, she indeed had a cardiac arrest, and we had a whole CCU set up in the plane. We resuscitated her as if it's just normal operating procedure. And she went on to get the valve successfully. So I'd seen this done, but I explained to Rabbi Quincy, you need very talented people who know what they're doing, and you need to be able to gather this equipment with no delay, because the situation needs immediate intervention to restore his blood pressure before his kidneys might shut down, God forbid, or he has irreversible changes in the brain circulation or whatever. So Rabbi Quincy gets off the phone and calls me back 5 minutes later and tells me, Dr. Weiss, we asked everyone around here, is there anyone in New York who has this kind of potential to put things together? And everyone says, absolutely not. Can we take him now to the hospital? And then Rabbi Quincy said, the alternative possibility is we ask you to come in and do this. And my heart sunk because A, I didn't have any medical contacts that I can really say I knew in New York City. B, I was a youngster and I didn't know beans from borscht about how you would organize the type of care that I saw my teachers give, let alone to be able to get the equipment. And I said, Rabbi Quincy, it doesn't make any sense. It's a 2-hour plane ride from Chicago to New York City. And it takes an hour for me to get from my home to where the airport is and park the car. And you don't get a plane every minute. It's not waiting for the next bus. It's like waiting for the next plane, which might be 1 or 2 hours between planes that are scheduled from Chicago to New York. And furthermore, I don't even know the way to Crown Heights at all. And I don't know what that entails, what kind of transportation, but I suppose you get a cab and you go there. Rabbi Quincy said, please follow my recommendation and my request and my pleading that you get on the plane. At the time he gave me this request, I realized it was a hopeless situation for me to be able to help, at least in my estimation. And B, I had just been recruited from Boston to take on the job in Chicago, and the people who employed me were not Jewish, and they would have no way of understanding how I could suddenly just drop what I was doing, leave them all the responsibilities, and just take off like this on a mission that didn't make any sense, even to me, in terms of the practicality of or the utility of my being there. But I went on because it was the Rebbe, and I had known about the Rebbe as a Cheder student, and we had such nice stories and such wonderful teaching from Rabbi Schusterman that I said, it's a situation you're not allowed to reject, even though it looks so hopeless. I'll do my best. Whatever might happen, I'll know that I tried my best. I wouldn't be able to look at myself if I didn't try. I went aboard that plane. First, I had to wait for the bank to open at 9 o'clock because we were like young puppies who didn't have credit cards, not to mention too much cash, but I had enough cash at home to have cash in the bank to pull it out to buy the airplane ticket. So I had to wait till 9 o'clock Chicago time to get the airplane ticket and then first get on the plane. And so when I got to the airport, I said, I'll run right over to the cab dispatcher or get a limousine or whatever and get right to Crown Heights, wherever that is in the New York map. I go to the dispatcher and he tells me, sir, we've been ordered by the state of New York, or by the city of New York, not to dispatch any livery services to Crown Heights because there was a murder, an interracial murder, 1 or 2 weeks earlier, and it's kind of on shutdown, and we can't allow you to endanger your life or the cab driver's life or his equipment by driving into Crown Heights. So I'll have to recommend that you take public transportation. I said, well, what does that entail? He said, well, first you catch a bus here from the LaGuardia Airport, go to Jackson Heights in Queens, and there they have a subway exchange, and you'll need 2 subways to get to Crown Heights. I said, how long is that going to take? He said, if you're really lucky, it might take 2 hours. I said, 2 hours? And I said, oh no, not only is this 4-hour trip 4 hours, but 2 more hours will throw it into uselessness. I decided to violate the law by going back into the airport. And in New York, there is a law that you can't recruit non-licensed livery to go from point A to B out of the airport. I said, I'll just try my luck. I'll maybe find someone who's looking for the money to be a driver for me to take me to Crown Heights against the law. And I'm asking this one and that one. And suddenly, while I'm busy looking for a ride like this, I'm apprehended by the police. And I said, oh no, my worst fear is to be apprehended by the police. Now for sure I'll never get to the Rebbe. And they asked me a question that baffled me. It said, sir, are you Dr. Weiss? I said, how would they ever know that they should ask me such a question? How are they thinking I'm coming here? And here's the answer. I'll take up my yacht. This was the answer. That Rebbe Krinsky had called the police and told them, look for anyone wearing a hat or a yarmulke on this warm day today. And if they are, they might very well be Dr. Weiss, who would be the only Orthodox Jew in that airport. Who else would be wearing a yarmulke in an airport on Shmini Atzeres? So it was a dead giveaway to the police. And the police chief who did this was a Jewish man himself. So he knew what he was looking for. He saw the yarmulke, the kippah, and he said, we've been sent by Rabbi Krinsky to pick you up and take you straight to Crown Heights. I said, oh my gosh, this is off the wall. So we really sped. I don't think I've ever gone in a car in the city so fast as the police took me through Queens and Brooklyn. And when we got to Brooklyn, I got out of the police car and I saw a complete sea of black, people in kapotas looking like they had just left because something really bad had happened. I said, oh no, I arrived too late. And this looks like it's preparatory for the worst thing you can imagine. Well, it wasn't quite that bad, I found out. But what I did see in the people's faces is they took one look at me and suddenly all hope was lost. I was at that time 33 and I looked a little younger. I looked more like a 23-year-old bocher. And that means I'm only 10 years out of bar mitzvah. And here's this big expert, Dr. White, everyone's talking about. Weiss is coming from Chicago to save the Rebbe. And they take a look at a bocher who looks like he should go back to medical school and learn something. So there was complete discouragement, but the police escorted me and parted the sea of black so I could walk to the 770 from the police car. When suddenly a big chassid jumps me. Now I'm about 6 feet. He must have been about 6'4", 6'6", maybe even. Really a big guy and much heavier than that, like a football player. And he's jumping me. And I said, oh no, he probably wants to smother me and take me out because I shouldn't be here. They want someone better than me for the Rebbe. But it turned out it was a very lovely man who's, as he introduced himself, his name was very familiar to me because when we were newly married 2 years earlier, I remember getting a call from South Africa. And this man's wife was in deep trouble from bacterial sepsis, bacterial infection after childbirth, and her life was just about lost. And it happens that I have connections and know people who handle infectious disease very smartly in South Africa. So I told him, call this and this doctor. I gave him the name. And this doctor will be the proper person to rescue your wife in such a dire situation. He calls back, this is 1975. He calls back and tells me that the doctor is on safari in Kenya. He's not available. But I heard the doctor's name and I said, I knew the doctor's name and I said, I remember distinctly when I was courting my wife after meeting her, I said, there's a graduate student in your building where you used to live who had the exact same name as this doctor. And she had like a British accent, it seemed. Maybe it was a South African accent. I don't know. Let's call her or let's go over to the house and see if she's related to this doctor. Well, it was her daughter. It was his daughter. And she told me they have a way of radioing him by shortwave radio on the safari in case anything like this would come up. And that's exactly what they did. And he exactly did that. He came out and saved the lady from death and brought her back to full health. And I was being thanked right there on the spot. That was the way to get to the door at 770. Now at the door was Rebbitzin Schneerson to greet me. And she looked not too ruffled by the whole situation. She looked like she was in full collection of her faculties, even though such a tragedy was happening. And she said, are you Dr. Weiss? And I said, I am. And she was very pleased to meet me. She said, Dr. Weiss, today is Shmini Atzeres, and I want you to come up and be reassured that my husband is doing better. And I said, how is that? Well, it happened that before I left on the trip, I had the thought of just calling Mount Sinai Hospital, where I remember one of my teachers in Boston had been appointed the chief of cardiology. His name was Dr. Louis Tischholz. Dr. Tischholz was an extraordinary man who had the facilities to see problems, solve them properly. He was a Jewish man. He didn't know anything about the Rebbe, but he was a man who observed the halacha of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And he kept his promise to me. When I made a call to Mount Sinai, I had miraculous luck in connecting with his office and with him directly, because the switchboard operator went down the hall herself to pull him almost by the ear to talk to me on the phone about this, because she could see there was such urgency. And he told me that he had a lot of jobs that day and responsibilities, but he would put everything down and pack his bags and bring quick equipment in. So while I was making this 5-hour trip from Chicago to New York, he would try his best to set up some type of care for the Rebbe. And he fulfilled his promise to 100%. And if you ever want to talk about the person who really should be remembered in the archives, it's Dr. Louis Tischholz, who did save the Rebbe's life with his bare hands and with his brilliant training and brilliant knack of getting things done. So it is not I. It is Dr. Tischholz who did the rescuing on the spot. And Rebbeson had a little kiddush with me. It was a short little kiddush, but it was very meaningful. And I said, I can't believe my lucky stars that really I brought Dr. Tischholz, and I davened with all my heart on the plane, hoping such a rescue could be made. And here, the answer was given by God's response to the prayer. And we went down to see the Rebbe, and it was a wonderful meeting. The Rebbe actually looked like he had restored himself considerably. He was mentally sharp. His heart rhythm was stable, and he began to ask us what had befallen him. And we explained that his heart had almost 1/2 of it seemed to have lost its blood supply through a blocked artery or blocked arteries, such that it was not contracting anymore. And all the work of the contracting heart had to be done by the remaining heart muscle. And the Rebbe said, what happens next? I said, well, we protect you from heart rhythm abnormalities. We do our best to prevent any more blocked arteries with anticoagulants. And we wait for this weakened part of the heart to become firm scar tissue around which the rest of the heart will contract. And you'll have less heart muscle to work with, but at least it can contract against something, the firm scar tissue of the damaged side. And the Rebbe was not satisfied with the answer. He said, Dr. Weiss and Dr. Tischholz, don't you realize that you could use stem cell research to transform these scar tissue cells back to muscle? And I said, Rebbe, I don't even think I've heard of stem cell. This was 1977. It was a new term even in magazines like Science and Nature, which the Rebbe read regularly. These are great magazines for those of you who are scientists. And I explained that really, this is not a technology remotely available to cardiologists or even thought of. The Rebbe said we should look into it. So he turned to the next cap, which is his brilliance in science and engineering. As you probably all know or have heard, the Rebbe trained in physics in Berlin and was under the tutelage of 2 people who won the Nobel Prize, one of whom, Erwin Schrödinger, became a lifelong friend of the Rebbe's, even though Schrödinger had to nominally sign as a Nazi to retain his post during the war years. And even though Schrödinger, was never, one who ever changed from his position as a non-Jew, he considered the Rebbe a close friend because of their being intellectual matches. And also in the Sorbonne, he trained as a mechanical engineer. So he had the skills of understanding the physics and mechanics of the heart when we showed him what it looked like with our hands, as I'm doing for you right now. So the Rebbe looked at this and he said, Dr. Weiss, a very brilliant strategy might be to shrink down the size of the heart. I'll explain why, Dr. Weiss, and here's why. He said, if you've ever had occasion to blow up a balloon at a birthday party, you'll recognize that the more you inflate the balloon and the larger it gets, the higher is the pressure within the balloon. I said, well, that's obvious. And correspondingly, the more tension there is in the wall. With a car tire, it's the same thing. You could overinflate a car tire, and there becomes more and more tension in the wall of the top of the tire, sometimes too much tension. And what you want to do here is reduce the tension in the wall so the muscle has an easier time contracting. Just like if you were a weak person, you want to be given light tasks to lift the load, not heavy tasks. If you have weak muscles and you're being given too heavy a package to live working as an employee in a store. He said, if we shrink the heart size down, it would help greatly with the mechanical efficiency of the ventricle. It was a brilliant idea. I said, well, how are we going to do that? He asked me. And Dr. Tischholz and I said, well, we could actually shrink the heart size down by restricting sodium or salt in the diet so that you don't retain as much water. Salt is a great blotter. All of you who've done ever koshered meat knows you put the salt on the meat, it draws the blood right out of the meat because it's like a draw. It's an osmotic draw of the blood and fluid. So the Rebbitzin and Rebbe looked over the diet that they were following. They eliminated foods that required koshering and stayed with kosher foods that don't require koshering, like fish. They stayed away from salty foods like cheese. They didn't have prepared soups that were salty. They didn't use, other than lemon juice and vinegar or oil and vinegar, they didn't use commercial dressings which have sodium in it or ketchup. And they markedly reduced the Rebbe's intake of sodium. And we showed with measurements made with echocardiograms that the heart physically came down in size, fulfilling the Rebbe's request for a smaller heart, less tension in the wall, and an easier time for the heart muscle to contract. Just like letting air out of the tire so the wall wasn't so stretched and the fibers of the rubber pulled together much more easily. It was a brilliant strategy, and it allowed us to go way beyond our expectations, because I must say, when we saw what had happened to the Rebbe, we were not expecting more than the possibility of just pulling him through for survival reasons, but not necessarily functional reasons, because we realized most people having heart attacks of this magnitude can't be expected to be physically functional anymore.
Is reducing sodium intake for shrinking the heart
yeah, you're retaining less fluid, you're allowing the heart to achieve a smaller geometry, and you're making the wall of the heart under much less pressure. It's the same thing on an automobile tire. Put more air in the tire, the wall of the rubber is being pulled harder. And if the tire were a muscle trying to contract, it would have a harder time contracting against high pressure than against low pressure. Just like if you were an employee in a store and I said, here, put this thing on the shelf, and you had a weak arm from some accident, you would say, this was too heavy for me to carry. So you give it to them.
Is this entirely the Rebbe's novel idea, or is this something which was like maybe new on the medical industry at the time?
It was not totally novel, because we as cardiologists were striving for this, but the Rebbe put it right on the line that we have to do this. He had not read cardiology texts, so it was for him a novel idea, and it was a very worthwhile idea, and now being practiced more and more. More and more of the cardiac therapies for chronic heart failure are to really keep the heart size as small as possible, so it has an easier time contracting. If you have a weak heart, you want to have a lighter workload, and that's how you do it. Also, it lowers the pressure to some extent, as long as you don't do it too extremely. I don't want you to be starving yourself without eating. If any of you have someone in the family who needs this kind of reduction in heart size, but you start with cutting down dramatically on the salt in the diet that's not necessary. And so this was so amazing. This is on day 1 and day 2. We're talking to the Rebbe on such a high level of thought, is that the Rebbe is just, going from one day to the next with his usual brilliant mind. And we had other very big advantages. Dr. Tischholz, who had been an advisor for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was one of the developers of a technology called telemonitoring, where you have little things pasted on your chest, and by electronic transmission, you pick it up on a little receiving station. All this was facilitated by the inventions of Texas Instrument down your way in Texas. I think they were in another city, not Houston, but they were down your way. And they pioneered the way of being able to actually have instruments that do this, which were used by the space program initially. And we wired the Rebbe up this way in the monitoring unit we set up in this little office in 770. In other words, instead of being strapped to bed like all patients, even the best hospitals in those days were, with big heavy wires and cables coming all over the chest, and you're kind of almost being bound in bed by all these cables. Imagine what it would be like to go to the bathroom with that kind of stuff, or imagine how private you would be with all this stuff pouring out of you. The Rebbe had nothing pouring out of him. He had his kapot on in our little mini hospital and looked like the Rebbe, and walked out of the bed sometimes like the Rebbe, not like what we'd expect in a hospital, which was a very big advantage psychologically for the Rebbe, and also just for the sense of security that he's still on the planet as a human being. The opposite, unfortunately, invariably was befalling all patients in regular hospitals getting cardiac care with the old-fashioned heavy cables and strapped up. You don't see this anymore because we do have telemonitors for everyone, but this was a new idea, and Dr. Tischholz was instrumental in bringing it to the Rebbe. We also had a unique method of medical care system. We had 5 doctors participating. Dr. Tischholz, myself, also my teacher, Dr. Loud from Boston, was brought in by the State Department, where he was on a research mission to come and take care of the Rebbe with me. And we had a childhood friend of mine, Larry Resnick, who was brought by the military from Honolulu, where he headed the Naval Hospital, to become the head of a facility in Staten Island so he could be near the Rebbe. And we had a team of people who worked very cooperatively and understood one another, even though we had different ideas. But we decided to have shifts of 4 hours limit, actually 4.5 hour limit, where we would do all the doctoring, all the charting, all the administration of medicines, all the consultations. Then 4 hours later, the next guy comes in, and the first guy who's exhausted goes off and walks around the block or walks across the Brooklyn Bridge or something just to ease up his mind. And it was such an effective way of utilizing our human limited manpower, because when I was in Boston at the Mass General in my internship and residency, I worked 36 hours straight and was 12 hours off for 2 straight years. And I remember sometimes when I said, I'm not going to make the 36 alive, it was so stressful and hard. It was brutal. And this was the exact opposite. It was a non-brutal system of putting someone to full-scale work 4 hours, spending a half hour on each side to transfer that time to the next guy. But it was a very interesting way of giving care with alert doctors who didn't say, well, I didn't understand the nurse's order, or the nurses couldn't read my order, so there was a medication mistake, or I forgot the medicine at this time. The doctor on duty was fully responsible to make no mistakes, 0 mistakes. And I have to say, in my being the auditor of the records, I didn't see a mistake made by any of our men. And it wasn't that they were covering any mistake. This was out in the open to all of us to see what was being done. And also, I kind of slept in the room with the Rebbe, so I had even when I was off on duty, I heard the buzz even when I was fast asleep, and knew when things were right and when things could be corrected a little bit. So it was a very effective care system. We went through this with the Rebbe for approximately 6 weeks. When we came up to Rosh Chodesh Kislev, the Rebbe told me that he had made a solemn promise to the previous Rebbe, his father-in-law, that he would, on every Shabbos Mevorchim, he would have a farbrengen. And here, this Shabbos went by, and he couldn't do a farbrengen, and he was so upset that he wasn't fulfilling his promise to his father-in-law. And we said the remedy might be that we could have you give a short radio broadcast to all your Hasidim right after Shabbos, Motzei Shabbos. And we set it up for him on an AM band that allowed us to broadcast. And I said to the Rebbe, we have to be very careful not to jar you with something that might grab your emotions. I said, what you have to do is limit yourself to 12 minutes. I'll be like the studio manager in our little radio station here while you're broadcasting, and I'll tell you when we have to pull the microphone away from you. So the Rebbe gave me a little wink, as he's prone to do with any of you who've met him face to face. And he gets on, and 12 minutes passes, and he's going strong on this talk. He's in full gear, very happy to be giving a message to the Hasidim by radio. And he keeps talking. And I said, Rebbe, it's time to break. I was giving him signals to get off, and he kept talking and giving me a little smile and a wink every time. When we got to 25 minutes, he finally got off, to my great pleasure, and he gave me even a better smile and a wink, and we became good friends even over his transgression of the rules of the radio broadcast. But it was very helpful. I realized then that the Rebbe needed to do this just to relieve his mind of the promise he made his father-in-law, and his need to also let people know that he was able to talk and present, which was very reassuring to the people of Chabad in the neighborhood who got this broadcast. It was a local broadcast in Brooklyn, as I recall. When we got up to Kislev, my partner, Larry Resnick, was the one who recognized that the Rebbe had spent enough time and was stable enough to go home from the monitoring. So he walked him part of the way home, and then the Rebbe was driven the rest of the way home, as I recall. I was not there, I was in Chicago. But the Rebbe told Dr. Resnick a very important thing. He said, Dr. Resnick, you might think I'm very happy about this because I've made the progress, and I certainly am very thankful to God for having survived this and made a lot of recovery progress. But the real victory here for me is to be able to rejoin the Rebbitzin back home for our afternoon custom of having tea in the late afternoon. And he told this to Resnick. He also told me later when I had occasion to come in and do a test Kislev for the farbrengen. And he amplified that a little further. He said, Dr. Weiss, to me, the privilege of having a private moment with my wife, time to talk over some tea, is as important to me as putting on tefillin in the morning. And I said, it's a very powerful thing that he said, that really, it's almost like a heavenly assignment, just like tefillin is a heavenly assignment. That the Rebbe recognizes for a marriage to be as solid as possible, that time has to be permitted. And he said he did it all his career, even though the pressures were on to perform, to answer letters and all that, he made that a very major priority on a regular basis. The Rebbe and Rebbitzin were a very, very close couple. And I'll mention in that regard, the Rebbe was such a wonderfully collected and smart intellectual lady. She dressed in a very modest but elegant style that was in no way telling of how much she knew of style. She just was very elegant in simplicity. When you go there into his home, she has a little section where she has books about science and atmosphere and animals, zoology, and she even had a player that would play a VHS video so she could see some science videos that were made at the New York Library, which she visited almost every week. She drove there herself to Bryant Park in New York City, where their library is, and took out books, read books in the library, and spent a good part of the day as part of her weekly routine to keep abreast of science and developments. She had a group of friends who spoke many, many languages, and they had intellectual discussions. Since they were in foreign tongues, I couldn't tell what they were, but I could see from the demeanor of the people and the tone of the conversation, they talked about big stuff. And it was something that was a great preoccupation for her, to be with friends who could discuss pressing matters affecting the world or affecting developments in the world or inventions in the world. It was a very interesting experience. I was in regular contact with the Rebbetzin on a nightly basis because I had to have a way of knowing what was going on with the Rebbe, and she always had her finger on the pulse directly. She also had a finger on my pulse because she knew that I was a bicycle rider. I always commuted to work on a bicycle. And over the years, that accumulated to 150,000 miles of commuting over 50 years, but she knew that I would go in any weather. So she would read the weather reports and treat me like a son. Isn't it too cold to wear just that, Dr. Weiss? So I would be advised to put on a heavier coat when she saw the temperatures dropping in Chicago, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine if I lived your way where it was nice and warm, I wouldn't have been coached as much. But she was very attentive to me, and she was also very good at presenting the details of how the Rebbe was really doing as she saw it and as she measured it by her own judgment. Many stories passed over the years. I made trips, as was said, almost every month, maybe every month and a half. So it tallied up to a lot of times back and forth to New York. I was always hosted by the Krinsky family, where I stayed overnight with Rabbi Krinsky and Devorah Krinsky's very accommodating and hospitable quarters. And they treated me so nicely that it helped a great deal. I always told that Devorah Krinsky of blessed memory that her hospitality made it very acceptable to be away and be working like this. When you're treated so nicely, you feel better, and it really helped a lot in the delivery of care to the Rebbe. The opposite would have been true if I had been dumped in some place that wasn't put together right, or too cold, too hot, not private enough and whatnot. They did everything right, as if they were running a high quality hotel and made sure I was being taken care of properly. And although I'm not a fancy person, being treated like that does help when you have a responsibility to take care of the Rebbe. And many stories can be told of.
Did the Rebbe ever discuss with you medicine, like when you were there, after Yom Tov and after farbrengens and before?
Did he discuss what?
Did you ever discuss the Rebbe, like with the Rebbe, things of Torah, stories that might have happened to you outside of medicine?
I used to read Sichas in English, so we sometimes went over what I had learned. I was particularly enchanted by the Sicha in English that was translated about his story about the Arba Minim, and how much he went into detail of the necessity of bringing together people of various levels of intellect and emotional tenor, and how you really don't get your society correct unless you have all these together, bound together, working together. And as I matured a little bit and getting older and learning more about life, I said, you learn more and more how critical that is, that sometimes one type of person who doesn't make much sense to you comes through to be the right person for the right time for a certain different type of assignment. And also just the fact that being honored by people who might think they're above him is a very important concept, just like it's a very important concept in the humility we all should have for any special gift we've been given. I love the way he developed it in the Sichos in English. I don't have it anymore. I don't know what happened to it, who rearranged my bookshelf, why it's not there. But I would sure love to reread that, because we had a nice discussion. I think Dr. Tischel and I both read that and talked it over with the Rebbe. I'm not sure if we were both in on that, but it was a very nice discussion. I didn't get a chance really to go into great depths about general philosophies or general concepts like this, because the visits were very oriented towards making sure the Rebbe got to sleep after a long farbrengen. My visits were often key to farbrengens, and you're talking about 1, 2 in the morning, and the mercy would be to see the Rebbe medically, make sure we got things straight, had a little discussion about things, and got him back to home so he could get a little sleep. The little that he got was at least, partly in my hands. If I were to talk too long, it might detract from his own health.
Did you ever see the Rebbe or check the Rebbe after Simchas Torah, after Hakafas?
I did.
Only after the farbrengen, the Kosher Bracha.
I did one time after Hakafas because I was a little worried about things early in the game. The remarkable thing about the Rebbe, I've actually said a little private detail, is although he's a normal human being, there's something about the way he responded to this overwhelming, physical and emotional stress that he was always under. He just sort of, when you took a look at him medically, he was like in order, as if he had been at a health club almost. It was remarkable. He wasn't like in a disarray. I would be in a disarray if I took a long bike ride or something. I wouldn't be so verschwitzed and all this. And the Rebbe was not quite like that. He was a different kind of person physically. I don't call him different from us as a human being, but I think he was somehow able to guide himself through these things. I mean, there were times when you could really detect that he couldn't handle the stress. I can give an example of this. So after several weeks of watching stability of his rhythm, we let him go out to a farbrengen on Houston Anash Kislev, the first farbrengen that I ever attended. And naturally, we would not take any chances, so we had him wired up with our telemonitors, which aren't visible. When you have a kapota on your telemonitors on your chest, you see nothing as an observer. And the Rebbe is not bulky or thick with wires. He has no wires. They're all underneath, very little delicate wires under the chest. And Dr. Resnick and I sat in a farbrengen, and all those who've been at a farbrengen realized we're all packed like sardines together. So even the guy sitting next to me at these long benches has no idea that on the floor is a high-priced monitor that's picking up radio signals from the Rebbe. And Dr. Resnick and I, just bowing our heads down, as many people do at a farbrengen, are looking at a monitor, not at our feet, or not deep in thought. And what happened is the Rebbe went into a sicha. It was the first sicha I had ever heard, the first farbrengen I ever attended. And out of the clear blue, the rhythm became almost chaotic. The heart rhythm became almost chaotic. And we were in panic. What do? You have a Rebbe up there on the public stage for the first time since his illness. It's kind of a trial run. And he's failing the test because he's going into this potentially life-threatening rhythm that could break down to no rhythm. And the logical thing that a cardiologist would do is stop the farbrengen, and if necessary, even apply an electric current if the rhythm is bad enough. And Dr. Resnick and I looked at each other. We didn't know what to do. We were in a cold sweat. We, not the Rebbe, were in the cold sweat, as I mentioned. But the Rebbe was in, I thought, grave danger if we don't take the initiative to stop the farbrengen and advise the Rebbe. I gave the Rebbe hand signals. We had certain hand signals we always worked out. But the Rebbe didn't, either check with me or didn't pick up on that. He kept talking. And I was so thankful when the sikha was over because the rhythm became normal again. It was like nothing had happened. That's how heart rhythms are. They come and they go. And when they go, it looks like they never were. So he went to the next sikha and exactly the same thing happened. Our hearts almost dropped when we saw the rhythm decaying like this. We said, we better stop this one or we'll be in hot water. We're taking too much of a chance. So we decided the same thing. If we go there and make a whole stir on the stage, we might destroy the Rebbe's future potency to be a Rebbe. No one will come up to talk to him, feeling if they come up and jar him, they'll be the ones who are responsible for his getting sick, God forbid. And the third sikha was the exact same story. Quiet rhythm in between sikhot, but at a sikha, it went sour. Finally, I heard this beautiful song, mellow tune being sung by the Hasidim, and I was told by one of the Hasidim, this is going to be a mimer. And it was so soothing and I was so jarred from the experiences of the three sikhas, I practically fell asleep by the lull of the beautiful nigun that they were singing. It was lulling me to some state outside the sphere of being a doctor. I needed to escape from all this. But I stayed awake enough to watch the mimer. And during the mimer, the rhythm was letter perfect. And that was the end of the rhythm problem that night. What we had learned the hard way was we got away with murder. We didn't stop the Rebbe, and we learned that you can't push the Rebbe that hard. And I'll explain why that story is an important one for later in the game on this whole story about the Rebbe. But we told the Rebbe that we had to go a little slower with him before bringing him out in the public and endangering him. And we told him the difference between a mimer and a sikha in terms of how it affected his heart rhythm. Well, as it turns out, we did learn a lot because, as you know, years later was the important Dida Nutzach case, where there were court proceedings being held to try to recover the books. And the defending team recruited some pretty sharp lawyers who wanted to do their best to derail our efforts. Fortunately, my own father, who was not trained in the universities or even in high school, he was an underprivileged young man who was kind of a blue-collar man who made his way by his own ingenuity. He told me to be wary that I'm practicing medicine in the state of New York when I don't have a license in New York. I only have a license in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in the state of Illinois. So he said, you better go down to the law library at Northwestern where you're teaching, Northwestern University, and look what the laws are for New York. So they had all the law library, the state laws of New York. And I found 2 pages that carefully delineated what my privileges are outside of my state. I was privileged to be a consultant at the request of a licensed doctor in New York. And I was privileged to write a consultation note, but I was not privileged to write a prescription, administer a drug, or do a procedure under any circumstance, unless it was life or death, like Good Samaritan law. So I stuck to this, and I didn't tell anyone about it. I kept the papers with me. And when I was called to court on the matter of the Rebbe's giving a testimony in a deposition, I was called to the court and challenged by my not having a license in New York. And I thought they were thinking they would derail me and disqualify me from any testimony. But I pulled up the papers and read to the judge, Silton, the whole story. And he said, this is exactly what the law books say, that you had the full right to do this under your license in Illinois. And the other team was so derailed, they were so demoralized because they thought for sure they'd have the Rebbe forced to be giving a deposition when we knew the deposition could kill him with an arrhythmia, that the matter was sent over to Rebbe Schneerson, who did a beautiful job giving the deposition. For those of you who've read the deposition of the Rebbe, it was brilliant. And the case, of course, was won. And we celebrated Dida Nutzach from that point on. But it was a great moment in court. I've never been in court. I've never been subject to a lawsuit. And so I was lucky that I had at least the wherewithal to listen to my father, who was always worth listening to. I would like to ask you, before I go on with too many stories, I would like to know if someone has other questions and would like to have the answer to those questions before we lose the evening to me blabbing around.
That would be wonderful. Anybody there in the crowd, we can hear you. Feel free to ask any questions you may have.
Sure, please don't be embarrassed to ask the question, even if you think it doesn't have merit, because it does have merit. We can fit it in some way to give you the answer and expand on the story.
I'd like to let you know that I saw you in Crown Heights in the morning, running out from Rabbi Gorani's office and driving the bicycle all over Crown Heights. You mentioned before about the crank of your bicycle. I saw the way you were driving very fast.
Did you hear him?
I didn't hear you. Someone can rephrase the question.
It's Rabbi Lazar. I've seen
you. Were mentioning before about you driving a bicycle. I happened to see it in life in Crown Heights. All of a sudden in the morning, I see somebody, a young man, comes out from Rabbi comes around his little house near 770. And you were standing out with that bicycle, running around all over Crown Heights. You remember that?
I do. I wish I had better connection to hear all the words you said, Rabbi Lazaroff.
He heard you. He saw you riding around the bicycle in Crown Heights.
I saw you driving the bicycle in Crown Heights.
Oh, yes.
Dr. Weiss, were there any conversations other than about medicine or about sikhs? Anything general that you can recall of interest?
Well, as I say, I didn't have the liberal amount of time that I needed to get involved with the Rebbe. I think Dr. Tischholz, who was much more of an intellect than I am, was able to engage the Rebbe intellectually, as was Dr. Larry Resnick. These are people who are on a much higher academic level than I am. And so they knew how to take the moment, even though it was limited, and extract something in a conversation with the Rebbe to see what the Rebbe's thoughts were. But I must say I was kind of a worker bee, not a queen bee or king bee in the hierarchy of people. And I don't regard myself as the person who could have engaged as well as they did with the Rebbe on intellectual matters. And my teacher, Bernard Laun, who became a Nobel laureate later, he too had the ability to engage with the Rebbe on his limited visits. So I'm sorry that I can't give you an answer.
Concern about your tzitzis.
What's that?
You clarified something about your tzitzis that the Rebbe.
Oh.
What was that story?
Well, it's just that when you do something like this for the Rebbe, there become legends about you that don't even belong there. Like the legend, Dr. Weiss goes around wearing special woolen tzitzis. Well, actually, I was wearing regular tzitzis like I always wore, and I was given a pair of woolen tzitzis when they found out that I wasn't wearing woolen tzitzis, and they were beautiful, and I did wear them for a while till they got old and irreplaceable. But things like that were told about, that Dr. Weiss does this and Dr. Weiss does this, and I didn't do any of those things.
But the Rebbe did prepare a siddur for you.
Yes, he did. I'll tell you the story. It's a little long. I hope I don't put people to sleep, but it is a nice story. So at 1981, which is 4 years into my being on the case, I recalled a story like this. I was approaching my 20th reunion from my public high school in Chicago that I attended. I went to secular schools, co-educational secular schools, and went to Buddhist Chabad Cheder after school in the first years of my education. But I was really in a public school system, and what was involved was going to a reunion every 10 years to see old classmates. And I loved my classmates. We had a very lively class, a lot of wonderful experiences and activities, and I learned much from them. It was very enriching. I'd say it's the most enriching part of my secular education, even more than the medical training. And so this was the 20th reunion, and the Rebbe was very excited about it. He said, Dr. Weiss, were you popular in your class? Did you have a lot of friends? I said, I didn't have, countless friends, but I think half the class and I got along pretty well. And it was a rich experience for me, and a chance to meet many people from different walks of their families and their lives. And so I didn't want to miss it. And I told the Rebbe how excited I was about it. And he was equally excited. But as it was, the reunion was to be held on Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos, going into Sunday on a weekend in the summer. And I told the Rebbe that I'm happy about this. And then on Friday morning, going into that weekend, I get a call from Benjamin Klein that Rebbetzin Schneerson is having fever, and she has certain spots on her skin that don't look just right. And she's also not able to concentrate as she normally would on the newspaper. And I said, there's something radically wrong here. This is not the Rebbetzin in any way. And this is not, old age and losing it. This is a global problem throughout the body with the spots, the fever. It's not like you lost the sense of things that you sometimes lose when you get older. And I had remembered back in 77, when I finished taking care of the Rebbe and stabilizing with Dr. Tischholz and my colleagues, that the Rebbe asked me to do him a favor by visiting the Rebbetzin medically, because she never went to the doctor. I said, could you, Dr. Weiss, listen to my wife's heart, just to know that she has good heart sounds? And I did exactly what the Rebbe asked me, and the Rebbetzin gave me permission. And lo and behold, there was a soft little murmur over one of the valves, an important valve in the heart. They're all important, but one of the more important valves, the kingpin valve. And I took note of it, and I assured the Rebbetzin that all the parts of the examination I did showed that this valve was not tightly narrowed or anything. I could feel good, strong dynamic pulses. And I gave her a reassurance that I heard the murmur, but that's all we're going to talk about. And every half year or so, I would go back and listen again just as a follow-up, just to be sure that things didn't change. When I heard the story from Benjamin Klein about how she was having the fever and the weakness of concentration and the spots on the skin, I put two and two together, and I said that it's entirely possible that this is a heart valve infection called endocarditis that's spraying little fragments off her valve into her brain, under her skin, causing these spots, all because she had something a little bit irregular about her valve, something a little roughened that caused the murmur. And I noticed that she had some dental problems that might have been the source of, because the most common source of bacterial infection of the heart, which is endocarditis, is dental problems, a deep cavity or something like this. So I made this diagnosis and told the Rebbetzin that we had to do measurements and echoes and do all kinds of blood tests, which we did. And Bob Feldman, the doctor in the neighborhood, devoted half his day just running back and forth 4 times a day to give her the proper infusion of the appropriate antibiotic. And it miraculously got her well. She would have not lived through this. This would have actually been a fatal error if we had just let it go. And so we'll take care of it when we get around to it. And luckily, the Rebbetzin was a very good patient. Luckily, Bob Feldman was there. A lot of things were very lucky. And lucky they told me the story, because they could have said, well, wait. The Rebbe was, very appreciative. Now, when I came, it was on Shabbos, against the Rebbe's advice. I said to Binyamin, I told him when I heard the story, when he told the Rebbe about it, the Rebbe said, tell Dr. Weiss, please come in maybe after the reunion, and there'll be plenty of time to see the Rebbetzin and take care of it. But I reasoned differently. I said, there's no time to wait on this. You don't want to have more of these things flying off the valve, causing more disruption of thinking or other things. A clot to the kidney could be very critical. So I hopped on a plane and got in when it was already Shabbos. And I was very nicely greeted by the public transportation system, which let me get on all the vehicles, the bus to the train and the trains. No one asked me to present in those days it was tokens, not cards. No one asked me for a token. They just said, sure, Dr. Weiss, you go ahead and take it. And so it was like a vertical Shabbos elevator for those who believe in Shabbos elevator. I don't quite believe in them, but in this case, I believe them suddenly. And it took me right to my destination. And I figured it was already closing in on 10 o'clock by the time I came to Crown Heights. By the time I came to 1304 President Street, where the Rebbe lived and the Rebbetzin lived, I said, they're going to be sound asleep. I'll probably have to knock hard on the door. There's no doorbell you can ring on Shabbos. And I'll probably have to rap on the window to get someone's attention. So I go up to the door and give initially a soft tap, because I was a little worried about treading upon the Rebbe and Rebbetzins privacy. And in a microsecond, the door flies open, and Chesed Halberstam, their helper, was right at the door, waiting my arrival and expecting my arrival, obviously, because he was right positioned there. My knock may not have been heard. The house is kind of big, and they go upstairs, and there's no knock that's heard at all. But I got this, and there in the parlor was sitting the Rebbe in his Shabbos clothes. He hadn't retired for the night quite yet. And next to him were 4 little Sidurim stacked in a little pile. And I recognized them as a newly released English translation of Tehilas Hashem that was miniaturized. And the Rebbe said, I'd like to hear what's going on with the Rebbetzin. And I gave him the whole story. And I said, I think we have a diagnosis that will be helpful to be treated. And we're getting right onto it. And the Rebbe then gave me a presentation of the 4 Sidurim. He said, right now you can't carry it out of the house, but after Shabbos, when you return home, be sure to give one to your Rebbetzin, and be sure one to give your 2 daughters. I have only 2 daughters then, my daughters Sarah and Rivka. And be sure to give one to yourself. And I was so thrilled with the present. It was a precious gift, which I still have. And the Rebbe had figured out that I would override his things. And as time went on, the Rebbetzin got better. The Rebbe showed his gratitude even more. And he went up to me and said, Dr. Weiss, I feel very happy that you came in and saved the day for the Rebbetzin, but tell me, what about the reunion? I said, well, I missed the reunion, but there'll be one in 10 years. We have one every 10 years, God willing, and we should be alive and well to see it. And I'll still keep in some contact with some of my friends who I know on a regular basis. He said, the Rebbe said, what about the rest of the people who you're not going to keep in contact with? How do you know what they're doing? I said, well, the good news is they all write little stories about themselves. Everyone's obliged to send in a page. The class was 500 large, and 300 have the energy to send in these things. And so probably about 250, 300 pages will be sent in, and they'll be put together as a book. The Rebbe said, when that book is put out and sent to you, I want you to, as a friend, read every one of the pages. I said, but Rebbe, some of the people I hardly ever engage with, and some I may not even know the names of who they are. And the Rebbe said, please, as a friend, read every page in that book. So, of course, when the book arrived, I followed the Rebbe's directive and read every page in the book. And on one page was a lady named Doreen, and I knew of her as a very high-class, student in our graduating class, but I had never had any occasion to engage with her. We had different course tracks, and we, socially, I didn't have occasion to meet her that much, but I just knew of her as a very high-caliber person. And I see that she's married to a man who became a kidney patient at the time when dialysis was used, but transplant was a very new technology. And I read that they researched it and went to University of Minnesota, which was the big pioneer in kidney transplant, and were successful in giving him a kidney. And I thought, I said, is that a miraculous story that they had the resources to think of going to the best place, which is always the best strategy medically. But more than that, she was such a nice girl. I'm sure she's taking good care of her husband. So I thought about this further. Right down the block of our little street where we live in this suburb of Chicago called Skokie, there's a couple who are our friends, and the wife has entered into kidney failure, and she is not doing that well with the dialysis, and is obviously not going to make the grade with dialysis. And they're thinking of the transplant, but because it's kind of new, they had to know where to turn, where to go. I said, I'm going to connect our couple, our neighbor down the street, with Doreen and her husband. And the connection was made, and it was an instant success. They glued together and bonded in such a positive way. And the couple who had the successful transplant encouraged our neighbors to do the same thing at the same place at University of Minnesota. And it was a very successful venture. I'm happy to say that even to this day, 40 years later, our neighbors are still alive and well, defying all the odds, going through the COVID thing and still going through it. And I'm very thankful that the Rebbe had me take his good advice. I didn't have any idea why he gave me the advice. I never had a chance to tell him the success of the story. I might have touched upon it, but I never got back to him really to tell him why. I think I did mention about the transplant. The Rebbe gave a bracha about it, but I wish the Rebbe could even know now, because he probably does know.
Wow. The young man is actually can't be in the in-person gathering because he's in quarantine.
Oh.
He doesn't want to come on the Zoom either. But he asked me to ask you,
okay,
how did Mrs. Weiss feel about you being in New York so often in the beginning? And this is from an 8th grader. He just wants to know.
That young man's going to go places. He's very perceptive. The truth is, it was very hard for her. First of all, I had transplanted her from her native Boston, Worcester upbringing to move her to Chicago because of the opportunity that arose. So she wasn't totally a happy camper to be displaced from her land, her people, the birthplace, which is a very important thing for everybody. Where they were born is often a very important facet of life. Born in here and raised in here. Secondly, she didn't have many people she could connect to. She didn't have, family or friends here, and was just beginning to get known because we're here just a year when all this developed. And thirdly, I was away a lot. The first 2 weeks when I was away full time, and she was getting calls from the people who had employed me, how angry they were, how embarrassing it was for her to have to talk to them on the phone about what was happening, how they had, as non-Jewish people, had no understanding what this could possibly be. One of them was a Catholic, and she said, if you had been asked to take care of the Pope, would you not have left your post? And the answer, of course, was yes, but he wasn't willing to say that to her. So it made her feel very bad that she even posed that question to him as a Catholic, would he have taken care of the Pope if asked to? And of course he would have. As a devout.
I have to show tremendous akars to Mrs. Weiss. Make sure she knows that from Houston, we're sending her the.
And she single-handedly raised the children beautifully. They all are really super duper dupers, to her credit, because I wasn't there enough I was working hard in my hospital, working hard at Chabad, and we get a million calls. We often get advice calls, which we welcomed, but they were quite demanding of the time that you need for the limited time you're home when you're working a very tough schedule. And I was a solo practitioner from that point. When I was relieved of my post, I took on to be a solo practitioner with my own rules. My rules were, I'm not going to bill anybody anything. I'll work with the insurance companies. I was not at all independently wealthy or wealthy at all, but I made a rule that the way I wanted to practice was to give them all the input that you need medically, irrespective of where they stood financially. I didn't want to put anyone in any kind of danger financially by billing heavily or billing at all. Even if it was a well-to-do person who owned everything, I said, I'm still going to treat everyone the same way. And it was a very successful way. I couldn't work for an organization in America with that policy. You couldn't be employed by a hospital, but the hospital still employed me for the things I could deliver, certain things like lectureships and teaching. So I was still very much in the loop, but it was not in the financial loop of the normal medical practices.
There's actually another question there from a young man.
Tell the young man I really appreciate the question.
What was that?
That was a very good question, I want to say.
Yeah. This is somewhat related, perhaps what you were talking about before, how the Rebbe was so happy to go have tea with the Rebbetzin.
Very.
When the Rebbetzin passed away, how did that affect the Rebbe's physical health? Or are you able to share anything about that?
I can't give you all the gory details. The Rebbe didn't have any breakdown, but you could see his demeanor was so changed because he had lost the person he loved the most in this world. And she died peacefully and quietly. It was bleed from a stomach ulcer, I believe. I wasn't on the case. I was at home hearing about this and running into the funeral. But I know that it was a short period of illness and a sudden thing. And the Rebbe sat quietly at the Shiva. You know, he would look up and acknowledge the people coming through, but he couldn't get as engaged. He was really destroyed by the loss in his heart. And I was devastated to see how devastated the Rebbe was. I was devastated to lose the Rebbitzin. She to me was a surrogate mother. I had three mothers. My very wonderful biological mother, the Rebbitzin served as a mother, and Rebbitzin Chana Schusterman was always very careful and protective of
So who took over the role of making sure you're wearing a coat in the winter days?
my wife. And she went a step farther. She not only made sure I was wearing a coat, she made sure she got the right kind of coat. So the down coat became popular at that point, and that's what I was wearing. So I could go in sub-zero weather, which we had sometimes in the winters. We aren't quite like Canada, but we get pretty cold in Chicago. And I would say that I never missed a beat on the bicycle. Once we had a major blizzard and a really horrible weather, and I was able to be the only cardiologist who could make it into the hospital to take care of some crises that developed. So I was called a snow hero. And I followed the rabbits.
Somebody there is trying to ask a question. Dr. Cutler, you trying to ask a question?
On your feet knew Rabbi Cement in Boston.
I did meet Rabbi Cement. Very nice, very fine.
Daughter married to one of his sons.
Oh my gosh, that's a yichus. Lovely.
Association with Chabad in Boston very widely.
How is the Cement family doing? Can you give me a little quick rundown?
Rabbi Cement passed away a few months ago.
I know.
Otherwise good. Thank God.
Well, I just want to have you send my regards to them. If anyone remembers me, I don't think I got to meet the family members as much as the doctor himself, but I'm very happy to hear that you have a connection like this. And
thank you.
Good people, wonderful people.
Beautiful stories, well conveyed.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm a little bit of a talk too long, and I think bore people, and it's probably late enough for people to say it's time for bedtime, but
I have a quick question. What was the Rebbe doing in his room for all those 5 weeks?
In his room?
Yeah. What was he doing?
He was looking at all the correspondence. They brought we initially debated, should he be given the sacks of mail? Because he took the mail very seriously. I'll even expand on that a little bit. But he looked at his mail and continued to read people's requests. And he didn't keep long hours of staying up all night as he was accustomed to do to answer the letters. But he took the letters serious enough that he sorted them out and gave replies when they were timely replies that needed to be given. And we were very careful to restrict his total amount of time of being dedicated like this. Right away at the beginning, we didn't let him do anything like that. He would just do some studies and daven with a minyan that we assembled in the room. But we acknowledged that he needed to do this. It was part of his lifeblood. And in fact, one time I learned that he would be reading letters when he was more healthy and going to the oil, that he would be coming back sometimes after the sun had set, and the Rebbe Krinsky was then organizing a minyan for Mincha. And I said, gee, after sunset, Mincha. And it was explained to me that the Rebbe said that God will more easily wait for the Mincha if we have the full intention to do it on time, but we have to answer someone's urgent request. We answer that person's urgent request first, and then daven Mincha. It was a very interesting. I don't give this as a mushal. I'm not trying to teach you to violate the rules of when you say Mincha, but it's the idea of weighing when something has urgency and you have to make a attempt to request or answer to someone's needs. You do that first, and then you will daven Mincha. And that's what the Rebbe did often from the Ohel when he had his big sacks of mail.
Everybody was at the oil.
The oil was a very stressful situation for the Rebbe because these requests involved some very complicated issues. I didn't snoop and read people's mail, but sometimes I heard through a label what he had to go through in reading the letters. It wasn't easy at all. It wasn't a great part of the cardiac regimen that we gave him.
It wasn't a great part of the cardiac regimen.
Yeah. Any additional comments or questions?
I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
I want to express my gratitude for the honor of being invited to join you. I wish that I could make a visit in person and see what what's going on in Houston, but I think the situation now is not permitting this, and maybe when we get some solutions, we'll clear it up. I just want to leave you with a little word that might apply to our current state of affairs in America and throughout the world, both from the standpoint of the discords and also the health situation. The Rebbe himself encountered the epidemic of 1918, which was an influenza A viral plague. At the time it hit their community in Europe, the Rebbe, of course, did not have access to a radio. I think the only people who had access to radio were people conducting wars like World War I. But there was no real broadcast system for the public. So you didn't get your news that way. And the delivery boy didn't drop the paper off every morning on your doorstep to get the latest news in print. You got news, but it was not the freshest news. So you had to sometimes make your own judgments. And the Rebbe was a very bright 16-year-old, just turning 16 in the spring when this plague came upon the world, a very heavy plague of a lot of people getting sick and a lot of people dying, including my own grandfather, after whom I'm named. His name was Yitzchak. I'm Yitzchak also. He was 32 when he died of that same epidemic, the same year the Rebbe, was involved. The Rebbe saw it as something analogous to being in a forest fire, where you're one of the trees next to other burning trees. And by sheer proximity, one fire can transmit to the other and easily take on the next tree. He said, we have one advantage over the trees, that we have legs and feet that could carry us out of the forest by just walking out of it on our own volition or our own ingenuity. So he decided to leave the yeshiva. He tried to encourage some of his friends to do likewise, and he studied under the guidance of his own father. And he and his mother and his father and his brother were confined to their house to protect themselves against the plague. And then after about 6 months, the Rebbe decided there were so many people in need of help that he decided to go out and help. And as luck would have it, he contracted this without dying, but he had a very bad fever that sent him into almost like a delirium. So he was good and sick. And we talked philosophically about this, about the balance between being good to yourself and taking care of yourself and being good to your neighbor, something at your own expense. It's a very difficult balance. And as you already know, the Rebbe took it out on himself to be good to his neighbor by answering these letters in a timely fashion, staying up all night. But he said, you have to balance this out. At the time we were having in America the AIDS epidemic, and he asked me a question. He said, Dr. Weiss, if you were confronted with a cardiac patient who has AIDS, would you take care of him? And I said, by all means, I would take care of the AIDS patient, provided that I was given the privilege of being protected with proper protective gear, and that the proper precautions were being taken in the hospital against the spread of this viral illness, AIDS. And if all those precautions were taken, of course, I would be obligated to take care of the patient and would willingly do it. And the Rebbe liked the answer. Of course, it's difficult sometimes to have this happen. Right now, we have the privilege of protecting ourselves by keeping our distance from other people so we don't spread it to them. And wearing the masks has been identified as a way of preventing spreading it. It may not protect you as much as it protects others, but the strategy of helping your neighbor is following the commandment, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So I would urge you to think about the national recommendation, hopefully enactment of some kind of law or rule, that we at least wear masks whenever we're in proximity to other people, so we don't foster the spread of the thing till it's mastered by a health program like vaccination. And the other thing I'll tell you is that things sometimes are in such disarray financially because of this plague, and losing lives and members of the family and the community is dreadfully heavy on the heart. But I once had a situation arising like this early in the time when I was taking care of the Rebbe, and I was complaining to Professor Herman Braunover, a great physicist in Israel, and a chassid of the Rebbe. I said, Herman, so many things are going wrong. This is happening. This is this. The Rebbe is having some trouble. We have to straighten out. And he said, Dr. Weiss, you're all wrong. It's not how many things are going wrong. It's how many things are going right for this place to be here in the first place. It requires so many rules that God laid down at the time of creation of how things join together, interact, and work. And these things are still in place. So we have to think the way Dr. Braunover thinks, that it's not how many things are going wrong, but it's how many things are going right. And if you think that way, probably the way the Rebbe thought most of the time, that you'll get the job done better to put things back together. And I want to give you all bracha to continue your good work for your community, spreading the teachings and examples of the Rebbe to your immediate congregation, and people outside the congregation, even non-Jews, should learn about what the Rebbe did in their own way. And I give you a bracha to continue with all your hard efforts, and it is difficult to be in these scattered parts of the world, on a certain type of shlichus, to be in Houston or to be on the other side of the earth, serving the needs of people in your community. And I want you to continue to be successful. And in being successful, it's for your sake, and it's also for the sake of the Rebbe's teachings and what he stood for. His last 15 years is when he solidified the program of shlichus on an industrial scale. And it was one of the most important outcomes of the success that God granted us in his care. So I want you to continue on and not forget this little word. I am good Chodesh and onward to better things.
Dr. Weiss, on behalf of the over 90 Lubavitcher families in Houston, I want to thank you for joining us. I know you had a very, very long day.
It wasn't too bad. It was actually a joy to see other people in other communities. I was hoping to see a bunch of cowboy hats, but my wish was not fulfilled. I used to be a little cowboy when I was a little boy, and I said, gee, I wish I were in Texas when I was a child.
Yeah, we had black cowboy hats.
Father has a question.
Rabbi Chaim, I want to tell Dr. Weiss the last at the mafia. Hello?
Yes.
Go ahead. We hear you.
Yeah.
Weiss, the Rebbe in 1973. President Shazar from Israel was here in Houston. And then a week later, he went to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe told about Houston, that Houston is Shara Shamayim.
Yeah.
That Houston is Shara Shamayim.
Well, explain, please. Explain me. Teach me.
Yaakov Avinu, when he took a drink, took a sleep, and he woke up, he says, that must be Shara Shamayim.
Wow.
Since here in Houston, we go to the moon. Shara Shamayim.
Well, I'm happy to have joined you in Shara Shamayim, and I hope to make a real visit sometime to say hello in person when the situation allows for it.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the honor of being invited, and continued success in all your work, and even in things outside of your immediate domain in the Chabad, that all your congregants should be successful in all their undertakings.
Oh, man.
We have a positive influence on the whole world, as did the Rebbe. We should follow his if we can. Okay. Now we'll get a little sleep and catch up and say hello to our wives and everything else. And we have a good Yom Tov.
Yom Tov. Thank you, Dr. Weiss.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi Lew, for joining us after your long day.
Yes.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, Rabbi. I didn't get a chance to meet Connie. I know I met Rabbi Lazarus, but not Connie, but I think, was she listening in too?
Huh? My wife, Connie? Yeah, she was listening.
You're good. I just wanted to acknowledge that it's a two-man team here for the Chabad of Houston. And
Dr. Weiss, may you have only good news and in good health.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the bracha. We all have bracha.
You have a big crowd that's pulling for you.
Thank you very much. And well, I think you have a big crowd all over the world who recognize the importance of your good deeds and your responsibilities. And a good night to all.
Good.